Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second session for the day. As Professor said, my name is Eleni Alexandraki. I'm about to start my third year here at CIFE, and I'm really excited to introduce our first speaker today, Claire Maxfield, Director at Atelier 10. And yeah, the stage is all yours.
All right, can you hear me? Is this turned on? All right. Okay, so I'm Claire Maxfield, Managing Director of Atelier 10 in the US. We've worked on 27 projects on the Stanford campus and also thousands all over the world. And I'm here to talk to you today about absolute zero carbon. So in the environmental movement, in the world of sustainability, we tend to really romanticize a time when humans were supposedly more in concert with nature. And we use a lot of wording that sort of harkens back to this time, right? We talk about restoring things, regenerating, renew, reuse. All of this is about sort of like going back to the past and saying, how can we get back there? And before I became an architect and then a sustainability consultant, I studied environmental sociology and history, and I think it's total bubkiss. I don't think that time existed, at least not in the West. I don't think we ever were in a place of harmony with nature. I don't think we can go back to it. I think instead what we need to do is redesign how we think about the built environment. Not start from scratch, but design it differently. Not go backwards to a previous design, but design it differently starting now. So this is the depressing part of the conversation. 2030 is our watershed year. We have 6 years left to really make some meaningful inroads. And I think at this point, everyone's sort of given up on 2030. They're thinking about 2050 as our time horizon. But everything we start doing right now needs to plant the seeds. If not for 2030, then for 2050. So we have very, very little time. Our industry is capable of change. We've changed before. We became, a sort of more sustainably minded industry relatively quickly, but we need to change again, and we need to change more quickly, and we need to bring everyone along with us. And what that has said to me over many years is that we need to become absolute zero carbon as soon as possible. So I'm going to talk about what that means. This is not a term that has a definition yet. I'm trying to make it have a definition. I'm trying to build a movement. So if you like this idea, join me. What we mean by absolute zero carbon at Atelier 10 is that rather than think about building emissions and then offsets, that might be things like net zero energy too, where you sometimes overproduce and you kind of offset the times where you underproduce on energy, right? You just say, we should have no emissions ever, at any point of time, in building design, through construction, through operations, and no minute of every day, any day, should we have GHG emissions. That's our goal, right? How do we get there? I'm going to show you what I think. But there's a whole lot of innovation, as we're talking about, needed to get there. So one of the projects I'm working on is the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. So I read John Doerr's book, Speed and Scale, and he talks about FDR's roadmap for winning World War II. And it was a napkin sketch, right? So that little thing in the top corner is the napkin sketch. That's how we won the war. And the idea was if it couldn't fit on a cocktail napkin, it's too complicated, nobody's gonna understand it. So we attempted to make a napkin sketch for absolute zero carbon. It's just 6 steps. It's so easy, guys. Only 6 things to remember, not complicated at all. Of course, for those of us in the building industry, we know every single one of these steps has like thousands of small bits that are needed. We know how complicated it is. But I'm gonna walk you through the 6 steps and how we talk through it. So the first step is kind of the easiest one. We need radically passive, all-electric design that saves energy and makes us more resilient, right? We know how to do this, but it is shocking how seldom it happens. Like every architect learns this in school. We all know passive design is the way. Almost none of my projects are set up for good passive design. So there's economic forces working against us. There's design aesthetics working against us. There's just urban conditions sometimes. But this is the easiest step. So we really need to do it every single time. And when we do this, we get a bunch of co-benefits, which is always my favorite term. Those co-benefits are resilience and health and wellness, better places for people, places that will last for the duration. So this is very easy to abandon, and when we abandon it, we sort of derail the entire plan for absolute zero carbon, but this is step 1. Step 2 is adaptive reuse that does as well as new construction on operational carbon emissions, so great on energy, and better on embodied carbon. This is an example in San Diego. Horton, the campus at Horton, it's an old shopping mall that was repositioned to be tech office space, and then guess what? Tech doesn't want any more office space, so now it's gonna be a lab. But in that process, it became an almost net zero operational carbon project, and we reduced embodied carbon by a huge amount. And we sort of kept intact a piece of history, right? So the co-benefit here is really around placemaking, and cities as independent places that don't look as generic as they might if they're all new construction, right? The third step, 24/7 renewable energy. So lots of folks are working on this. This is not easy to acquire right now, but the idea is that every minute of every day, you're powered by renewable sources. So you don't sometimes overproduce when the sun is out and sometimes underproduce and call it even. You never use fossil fuels. So the goal here is really about boycotting an industry, right? If we're ever using that industry, if we're ever buying fossil fuels, we are propping up the fossil fuel industry that we wish would go away. So we really, truly need to kind of embrace what it means to not be reliant on them. And that means a transition to a renewable grid, right? We're not going to be able to do it on our own. Buildings aren't on islands. But we need to find a way to design for that future. And the reason I have a picture of Frank Lloyd Wright's wife up here wearing a Frank Lloyd Wright designed dress is that as designers, we love to get obsessive about the details of our projects, right? If you're Frank Lloyd Wright, you start designing furniture, and then you start designing dresses for the women who occupy your building. That's a whole other talk, right, about the objectification of women. But the point is, we get obsessive about the details. We need to start getting obsessive about the details of things like our grid connections. It's not nearly as sexy, but it really shows that we're kind of expanding the scope of design from individual buildings and parcels into the infrastructure they touch. We have to take that on as our design project. Next, we need to protect the functional ecosystems we have and rehabilitate the other landscapes we have into functional ecosystems. So most of them are not, right? I mean, Stanford has an amazing, beautiful campus, but this is not a functional ecosystem, right? Urban projects don't have functional ecosystems. So where we've got them, we need to make sure they stay functional, and where we don't have them, we need to kind of transform what we've got into places where people can be, but also functional ecosystems that can sequester carbon, support our habitats, and be places for more than people. So this is an example of the Teddy Roosevelt Presidential Library. He's getting a library, guys. It's a little late, but it's happening. It's in Medora, North Dakota. And on that landscape, we've got a whole plan about using this site to sequester carbon, to restore native landscape management techniques. So Native American burning techniques will be restored to this landscape that actually fix carbon in the landscape, even though we're burning stuff. It's very anathema to we Californians, but it's gonna work. So this idea that landscape is part of our carbon cycle, it's part of the habitat for creatures who are not us. We need to really take that on as a serious project. Transportation is a little hard to figure out where to even begin, right? So I said, serious attention to transportation. As project designers, we often are not involved in site selection or choosing where our buildings are located, but we kind of need to wrap our arms around that too and take responsibility for it. As our transportation infrastructure gets electrified, the entire energy backbone of our vehicles is happening in our buildings. So we are designing that backbone when we design the building. The cars are literally plugged into the building to charge. So that's our energy use now, our carbon footprint. And there's some amount of interactivity that's being explored, right? Vehicle to battery, vehicle battery to building, back and forth may be an option. Obviously, site selection, mass transit options are really important parts of our project, but we've got to kind of take that piece of the carbon pie as our own as well. And then possibly the hardest one, it's the one I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about, is we need zero embodied carbon materials and carbon sequestering materials. So this is not ready for prime time. We don't have buildings that are capable of doing this yet, but we need to prep ourselves so that by 2050 we can. In general, in the sustainable materials world, the carbon sequestering materials we have are, I'm going to call them, they're kind of some hippie shit. They're like, my blue jeans, insulation, and sheep's wool stuff. There's stuff that have not made it to the commercial buildings market. We need the next generation of those materials. And the analogy I always use is that we don't need the lentil loaf of materials, we need the impossible meat of materials. Highly engineered, yet carbon sequestering, bio-based materials. There's all sorts of cool stuff getting researched right now. Very little of it is made to market, and it's got to go through, buildings are slow, man. We've got to go through this whole process of those things coming to market, and then we pilot them, and then we convince ourselves they'll last for a long time. It's a really slow process, so we've got to get on that process this minute. So this roadmap illustrates, right? I've talked about transportation, the grid, materials. Why on earth would we talk about buildings here? I think buildings are the key. I'm a building designer, but I also think buildings have this really unique quality in that they're connected to all of these pieces of infrastructure I just mentioned. So like back in the day, you used to see a lot of innovation happening through cars, right? Like things got small because they wanted to get put into cars. But buildings are connected to everything I just mentioned, right? Transportation, ecosystems, materials, electrical production, municipal water supplies. All of these things come together in buildings. So buildings become our lever for change. If we can design buildings to be different, we can sort of reach our influence out into all of those other systems and get them to change along with us. So I think buildings are actually an incredibly powerful tool to change all of these systems I just mentioned. So I'm going to talk first about material supply chain. So let's talk about what the big ones, right? In buildings, concrete and steel. Concrete and steel account for 15% of global GHGs. So does the United States. So if we could fix concrete and steel, we could basically fix the entire US greenhouse gas footprint, which is highly problematic, right? So that's a huge amount of agency that the folks in the buildings world have. About 70% of that cement and steel is used for buildings. Buildings and bridges, I'll say, but not other forms of infrastructure. So we have a lot of power to transform a huge portion of the global footprint. So what are we going to do to get to zero carbon materials? We have like a couple options at our disposal here. So there's design to use less. We can make conventional materials better, like concrete and steel. We can invest in carbon sequestering materials, as I mentioned a moment ago. And we can think harder about what it means to use local or traditional materials. So I'm going to talk really quickly about each of these. So design for less. I am an architect. I love architecture. And yet, the era of the heroic cantilever needs to end. These buildings use too much carbon. It's just simply irresponsible, right? And that's a really controversial thing for me to say. Much of my work is with start architects who make iconic projects. I believe in the power of iconic projects. But we have to take a look at what that implication means for the carbon world. I mentioned what I think about these carbon sequestering materials, right? That there's all sorts of, in particular, like wood-based products and algae-based products in the concrete industry alone, right? Which isn't even bio-based, right? Everyone's trying to look at, could it become bio-based? Can we have algae-based concrete? There's so much cool stuff happening. But it's going to take a lot of work collectively in the buildings industry to find the ones that work and champion them, get them installed on projects, get them the sort of durability seal of approval that we need for buildings, and really get them onto the market. So that's a huge project for us all to take on. Local and traditional materials often are not an option, sadly, in our modern projects, but sometimes they are, and when they are magical. So, I mean, there's really stunning examples of contemporary architecture that take advantage of traditional materials used in local ways. And of course, there's a whole like cultural movement behind that, right? About capturing the magic of a place and of traditional materials and employing different folks than are traditionally used in modern construction. So there's a lot there when we can do it. And local material doesn't have to mean traditional. So urban mining is starting to be a new idea, right? That we could actually deconstruct buildings and reuse those materials in place, not recycle them, but reuse them. So can I dismantle a building and reuse its steel beams? We're starting to think about, material banks that exist in our cities and how those could be repurposed. And then just to make this even slightly more challenging, our materials market is not just about carbon. It's about waste, about ecosystem destruction. There's a huge health and safety component. There's an environmental justice component. And we have a tendency in the buildings world to solve for one of these problems and exacerbate the others, right? So like, we know right now we're going all electric and investing in PVs, and we know there's a lot of human rights violations happening with certain Chinese PV producers, right? So you can go big in one area and accidentally cause harm in another. So the challenge before us is to attempt to solve it all at once. We really, between now and 2050, have one shot at transforming the materials market. We can't transform it for GHGs and then be like, oops, we made everyone's lives better, transform it again. Oops, we caused a bunch of toxicity, transform it again. We kind of have to do it all at once and take that very seriously. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort. We won't always know the unintended consequences of our materials decisions, but we've got to at least attempt to look at those things holistically. So what does that all mean? The call to action here is saying, we think buildings are good levers of change. We think we should start prepping for 2050 now and take that as a very serious proposition. We think every building we work on should tackle at least one of these topics, if not more than one. And whatever the heck you learn, share it everywhere because there's so much to learn and to change. We desperately need better ways to share information with each other. So I'm going to talk extremely quickly about one project that embodies a couple of these steps but doesn't even come close to absolute zero carbon. I'm very proud of it. It took a lot of work. It was really hard, but it's far short of what I'm calling for. Yet still, I think it's a decent example. So this is the San Mateo County Civic Center in Redwood City, close to you guys. I'm going to just zip through what this looks like. But the first step we did right was we actually made it passive. So when we showed these kind of diagrams to the client, every single project here has thin bars that can be fully daylit and naturally ventilated. We didn't show them anything that could not be. Step one, right? So our plan is sort of a classic passive design plan. The few places that want to be dark are inset in the corners in the red. Everything else has access to daylight and cross ventilation. We did things like set facade performance targets before our architects started designing. So this very boring table here is like looking at a slate of facades and saying, what should be the facade drivers? How should they perform? Now please, architect, go design something that performs in that way. We designed this during COVID. So for once, oh my God, we got to naturally ventilate a building. COVID made it very imperative for a very brief period that we have operable windows, right? Everyone has already forgotten about that. But it made it possible to naturally ventilate to save energy, to make more resilience, and in this case, to be a bit more pandemic prepared. So we looked at things like, how many windows do we really need? Can we afford it? Are they automated? Are they manual? Do we need thermal mass or not? In the beautiful climate that is the South Bay, we can naturally ventilate for a huge amount of time. So in our March through September period, 85% of the time we can naturally ventilate. We don't need our cooling or even our fans. It's wonderful. It's still very difficult to get this through projects, however. We did a bunch of stuff with mechanical systems to make the project net zero. So I'm not going to go through the whole list, but a lot of work on heating, cooling, ventilation, elevators, high efficiency lighting, and so forth and so on to get us to net zero. We spent a lot of time on equipment. So people's computers in the building can take us from being way below net zero to way, way worse than net zero, depending on what equipment they buy and turn on. So we had a whole occupant engagement program to say, you got to use better equipment. We've got PVs, partly on our roof, partly on a garage next door, and the building's mass timber. So mass timber, the short story for embodied carbon is, if we count for biogenic sequestration, we're saving about 70% of our embodied carbon by choosing to go with mass timber. And this is the building. Occupied, not yet officially open, but it's net zero, it's all electric, it's LEED Platinum. It's got this low embodied carbon. It's partway through a couple of those steps for absolute zero carbon, but not all the way there. So that's it. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm going to pass the baton to our next speaker.